a country on the edge of economic collapse, the world's largest proven oil reserves beneath its soil, and a message from Washington that is not a negotiation but a condition. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and what the Trump administration is doing with Venezuela right now tells us something far bigger than oil. This is about leverage, about survival, about who gets to stay inside the Western Hemisphere and who gets pushed out. The demand is simple, almost brutal. Choose the United States or lose everything else. Cut ties with China, with Russia, with Iran, with Cuba. Hand over control of your oil future. And maybe, just maybe, your economy gets another breath. If you want to understand how power actually works in the 21st century, this is the moment to pay attention. Because this story is not really about Venezuela. It's about the system we are all living inside. And to understand how we got here, we need to step back. To understand this moment, we need to be precise about what is actually being asked and why it matters. This is not a traditional foreign policy demand. It is a structural reset. The Trump administration is telling Venezuela's interim government that oil production can resume only if the country rewires its geopolitical alignment. Not reforms later, not promises someday, alignment first. Oil is no longer just a commodity here. It is the gatekeeper to legitimacy, revenue, and time. Washington is offering a narrow path, economic survival in exchange for exclusivity. U.S. companies favored U.S. control over oil revenues, U.S. oversight over where the money goes and where it does not. Wrapped around this are familiar ideals: elections, political prisoners, counter-narcotics, but make no mistake, those are secondary. The core issue is this: who controls Venezuela's oil and who gets shut out of it? Because in today's world, energy is not just power. It is alignment. And to see why Venezuela ended up here, we have to go back to the forces that made oil both its blessing and its trap. To understand Venezuela's vulnerability, we have to look beyond personalities and into history, into a cycle that has repeated itself across resource-rich nations. For decades, oil shaped Venezuela's destiny. It funded the state, it propped up social programs, and slowly it crowded out everything else. When oil prices were high, the system looked stable. When prices fell, the cracks became fatal. Instead of diversification, Venezuela doubled down. Instead of institutions, it relied on loyalty. Oil revenue replaced accountability. Then came sanctions, mismanagement, and isolation. Production collapsed, infrastructure decayed, and oil, once an engine, became a dependency. This is the trap of petrostates. When your economy runs on one lever, whoever controls that lever controls you. As Western pressure grew, Venezuela turned elsewhere to China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. Not out of ideology alone, but necessity. Those relationships kept the system alive. But they also locked Venezuela into a geopolitical corner. And now that corner has disappeared. Because when survival depends on oil, and oil depends on permission, history stops being background. It becomes destiny. And that brings us to the first real rupture, the moment pressure turned into crisis. The first rupture came quietly, then all at once. Over a single weekend, Nicolas Maduro was removed. Not by election, not by gradual transition, but by a coordinated pressure campaign that left no room to maneuver. And suddenly, Venezuela was no longer negotiating with the world. It was negotiating with time. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials made their assessment clear. Without oil sales, Venezuela's economy could survive only weeks, not months, weeks. This was the moment when leverage became absolute, because oil was already extracted, tankers were ready, and Washington now held the switch: who buys, who sells, and who controls the money. The offer was precise. Tens of millions of barrels could move, revenue could flow, but only under American supervision, only if foreign adversaries were pushed out. This was not chaos. It was design A crisis engineered not to destroy the state, but to force a decision. And here is the uncomfortable truth. It worked. Pressure without invasion. Regime change without occupation. Power exercised through economics, not bombs. If this feels unsettling, it should, because once this model succeeds, it does not stay contained. And the real question becomes, what exactly is being built behind the scenes? That takes us to the machinery itself, the system few people see, but everyone lives under. What we are witnessing is not improvisation. It is a mechanism refined, modern, and deliberately quiet. At the center of it is control without ownership. The United States is not nationalizing Venezuelan oil. It is doing something far more subtle, controlling access, partners, and cash flow. Oil sales move forward, but the money does not go where it used to. It is held, managed, dispersed conditionally. This is how power now operates in a globalized system. You do not seize assets. You regulate oxygen. By favoring U.S. oil companies, Washington locks in technical expertise, infrastructure rebuilding, and long-term dependency. By demanding Venezuela cut ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba, it doesn't just remove competitors, it collapses alternative lifelines. And the military buildup offshore, that is not invasion. It is punctuation. A reminder that economic pressure is backed by force, even if force never moves. This is 21st century statecraft. No declarations, no occupations. Just leverage, sequencing, and patience. But systems like this always produce friction, because once control tightens, something else begins to break. And that brings us to the second crisis, faster, sharper, and far more visible. The second crisis did not unfold in conference rooms. It unfolded in markets, ports, and power centers across the region. As Washington moved to block Venezuela's oil from flowing to foreign adversaries, the shock traveled fast. Tanker routes stalled. Contracts were frozen. Long-standing back channels went silent. For China, Russia, and Iran, this was not just a loss of oil. It was a signal the Western Hemisphere was being redrawn not by borders, but by exclusion. Inside Venezuela, the pressure intensified. Decisions that once took months were now compressed into days. Every delay carried a cost. Every hesitation narrowed the exit. And outside the country, allies watched carefully. Because this was no longer about Caracas alone. It was about precedent. If a state could be economically cornered, politically rewired, and geopolitically realigned without a single shot fired, then power had found a new acceleration. This was the moment when diplomacy became speed, when leverage became momentum. And momentum does not wait for consensus. But the real impact of this kind of pressure is never measured first in capitals or boardrooms. It is felt elsewhere, closer to the ground. Which brings us to the most important question of all. What does this mean for the people living inside the system? If you live inside Venezuela today, none of this feels abstract. It feels personal, because while governments negotiate oil flows and alliances, you are negotiating daily survival. You are watching prices change overnight. You are wondering whether salaries will stretch another week. You are asking whether stability is finally coming or whether this is just another cycle of promises made above your head. This kind of pressure creates a moral dilemma. You don't get to choose. Economic oxygen may return, but it comes with conditions you never voted on. And yet, when the alternative is collapse, choice becomes a luxury. This is the quiet cruelty of geopolitics. Systems stabilize first, people adapt later. Some Venezuelans may see hope, jobs returning, infrastructure rebuilding, shelves slowly refilling. Others will feel the weight of dependence shift from one external power to another. Different flag, same leverage. If you are watching this from elsewhere, don't look away, because this is not just their story. It is a preview of how power treats ordinary lives when survival becomes negotiable. If This perspective matters to you if you believe people should understand the forces shaping their future. Stay with me, because the consequences of this moment do not stop at Venezuela's borders. They ripple outward, and that takes us to the global stage. On the global stage, this moment lands like a quiet earthquake. What the Trump administration is signaling is not just a Venezuela policy. It is a doctrine, a declaration that the Western Hemisphere is no longer a shared space of influence, but a guarded system. Access is conditional. Participation is selective. For China, this is a setback to years of patient economic statecraft. For Russia and Iran, it is a reminder of geographic limits. For smaller nations, it is a lesson absorbed quickly and silently. Energy markets feel it too. When tens of millions of barrels are rerouted under political control, price signals blur. Politics begins to outweigh supply and demand. And US allies take note. Not with outrage, but calculation. Because if leverage works here, it becomes a template. This is how global order shifts now, not through summits or treaties, but through targeted pressure points. Oil, finance, access. The world is fragmenting into zones of influence that are less ideological and more transactional. And once that happens, neutrality becomes harder to sustain. Because systems like this don't just manage crises, they shape futures. Which raises the final, unavoidable question: where does this road lead? To answer that, we have to look forward and consider the paths ahead. Looking ahead, there are three possible futures, and none of them are clean. The first is the optimistic path. Venezuela stabilizes, oil revenue returns under supervision, infrastructure is slowly rebuilt with US technical support, elections follow, imperfect but real. Over time, the country reconnects to global markets, this time with stronger guardrails. Power is constrained, corruption is reduced, the system bends but does not break. The second path is muddled, and more likely, oil flows resume, but dependency deepens. Political reform lags behind economic relief. External control replaces internal dysfunction. Venezuela survives, but on borrowed autonomy. Stability comes without sovereignty. The country functions, but never fully chooses. The third path is darker. Resistance hardens. Foreign adversaries find new channels. Pressure escalates. Economic relief stalls. The state fragments under competing loyalties. What was meant to stabilize instead destabilizes, and the region absorbs the shock. These are not predictions. They are structural outcomes, because systems reward alignment, not intention. And here is the deeper truth. The future of Venezuela will not be decided by promises, but by whether power learns restraint. And that brings us to the final question, not about Venezuela, but about us. What is unfolding in Venezuela forces us to confront a reality we often prefer to ignore. Power today does not announce itself. It manages, it conditions, it decides who breathes and under what terms. The Trump administration's approach may succeed, it may stabilize a broken state without war, it may push rivals out and restore order. History may even call it effective. But effectiveness is not the same as wisdom, because when survival is negotiated behind closed doors, democracy becomes procedural. When resources are controlled externally, sovereignty becomes symbolic. And when leverage replaces consent, stability rests on silence, not trust. This is not about whether America is right or wrong. It is about understanding the system being built, a system where power is quieter, faster, more transactional, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. If you want to understand how the world is really being reshaped, not by speeches, but by pressure, stay with this conversation, share it, question it, push it further, because the future will not be decided by those who shout the loudest. It will be decided by those who understand the rules early. And this story is far from over.